Perhaps the fact that we bleed to death makes us human. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. We always try to do a looser summer theme, and to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Jurassic Park film, we're doing a Summer of Crichton. Life indeed did find a way, so much so that we had to take a brief hiatus in July, but we are back, and this time we are talking about the Andromeda Strain. As you probably heard in the intro, Matt can't join us for this episode. We definitely miss him, but I am so excited we are talking about this particular Crichton book. As much as I love Jurassic Park, I will say that the Andromeda Strain holds a particular place in my heart. So here's a little bit about this story. This book was published in 1969. It was one of the first ones that was published under Crichton's own name. He's used several pen names, including John Lang, Jeffrey Hudson, and Michael Douglas. Not that Michael Douglas, obviously. But this is often considered his first bestseller and the book that started his career as one of the big name writers. This was turned into a 1971 film, and later in 2008 it was remade, or I guess readapted, into a miniseries. So here's some fun facts about, well, I guess the film, particularly for us, why we wanted to talk about it. The film, the 1971 film adaptation of The Andromeda Strain, was written by Nelson Gidding. He did the screenplay and was directed by Robert Wise. Now, for those of you who have listened to this podcast for long enough, those names probably stand out a little bit because Nelson Gidding and Robert Wise have teamed up before. They did the film The Haunting, which is, of course, the film adaptation of Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, and one of our personal favorite films. I know Mel and I have talked about this film quite a lot, both in our academic career and also in on this podcast. So that's kind of a fun connection to see this. And yeah, so I guess we'll just get started talking about the Andromeda Strain. Before I kind of jump into my history with this book, Mel, I'm curious to get some of your thoughts on this. It's a little bit different, I think, from Jurassic Park. I mean, we do get the kind of science thriller aspect that's also there, but this, in a lot of ways, feels a lot more horrific to me than Jurassic Park does. That one feels more like on the level of like an amusement park scare to me. You know, it's thrilling in a fun way, but this is kind of a terrifying story. So yeah, I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, first, I have to say that my only experience really with the Andromeda Strain is the 1971 movie, which I rewatched for this particular episode. So I do not have the history with the book that I think you have. This is one of those Crichton books that I'm pretty sure I had always meant to read. I probably even owned the book somewhere, but didn't get to. The problem that readers often have. But just thinking about the movie, which I've read, is quite similar to the book. And one major difference that I think is interesting is the addition of a woman who's one of the scientists. But I agree with you that there's something a little bit maybe more terrifying about this than Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is scary, but it is dinosaurs running around a amusement park. Whereas this, I think, especially watching it this time, post COVID, has that kind of atmosphere of possibility to it that even though we are seriously trying things that are kind of like Jurassic Park, I'm not sure if we would get Jurassic Park per se, but I could totally see, you know, some sort of virus or even, dare we say, alien entity coming and messing with us in some way. And I like in the movie the kind of emphasis on the scientists trying to figure it out, which, of course, Michael Crichton, had an MD from Harvard and tried to use in his writing real science, at least as starting off points. So it kind of makes sense to me that in the movie they would try to be, I guess, realistic in their portrayal of the equipment and the things that the scientists are doing. But yeah, I definitely think watching it this time, post COVID, it had a different, it hit me in a different way. Watching the people in the suits and being careful about vectors of transmission and failing miserably at it. These were all things that made me kind of think of recent things in our current events and in our recent history. I mean, we even have people talking about the possibility of aliens now. So I guess in some ways, this film might even be more of the moment than it was when it came out in the 70s, on the heels of the other kind of space movies of the time.
I have to say, when I first read the book, was not expecting this to ever feel like a timely book in my life. And listening to you talk about it in that way, it's a little bit, I guess, is a little bit funny, but also terrifying, kind of on equal levels. And I mean, funny in the most like absurd way possible. But um, yeah, we are definitely living in a time where obviously we know that pandemics are absolutely a thing that can um, be devastating in our lives, but also the way, yeah, the news and just kind of people in general and the government talking just very nonchalantly about the existence of aliens. And not only that, but aliens who like want to visit and perhaps have visited Earth, makes this one feel oddly timely in a way. But yeah, I like that you pointed out that Crichton does have an MD, and so that when he's writing these books, that's one of the things that he really draws upon is this idea of kind of real science. And so in a way, I mean, I know a lot of his stuff is called like either like straight up science fiction. I think people talked to like techno thriller was one of the terms that people really liked in like the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. And I don't know if we really use that term so much in publishing anymore, but when I look at his work, it really is more what I would consider true speculative fiction. You know, this idea that the world is very grounded in the world that we know, and that the science is so grounded um, in real science. I mean, even Jurassic Park, which I think the reason I always lean on that being like not as terrifying is because I don't expect that to happen anytime soon. But I remember even when I read this the first time, I thought, this could happen. And as we've pointed out, even more so now, you know, he's really kind of taking things that are possible in our world and kind of following them to their terrifying conclusions, which, um, yeah, is I think one of his strengths as a writer, and certainly one of the strengths of this. So a little bit about my history with this book. I read the book first. So that one, the book sticks in my mind more than the movies. I know I saw the 1971 film. And I also remember watching the 2008 miniseries, which was done by Ridley Scott and Frank Darabont. And it starred Benjamin Bratt. I don't remember much else about it other than enjoying it when I saw it, but I only saw it the one time when it was on television. So I remember being excited because I love the story. And you're right. I think both adaptations follow it pretty closely as far as the main points of the story. I want to say I first read this book in high school, and we may have talked about this on the podcast when we talked about uh, the horror of kind of illnesses and pandemics and epidemics and those kind of outbreak style stories. Because when Outbreak came out, which I believe was in 1995, which would have put me early in my high school career, I remember being absolutely not just terrified by what I saw on the screen with Outbreak, but also I couldn't get enough of it. And I went kind of crazy seeking out all of these different kind of outbreak style stories. I remember reading Camus' The Plague several times. And this book came to me via summer reading, I think, because it was on the list of my summer reading. Like, for school, they'll give you a list of like 10 books and they'll say, read 3 of these or something like that. And this was one of the books that was on the list. And I remember looking it up in the library and realizing that it was an Outbreak book. And I was like, okay, sold. And when I tell you this book was so terrifying to me, I remember vividly the descriptions of the people getting sick. And there's a scene in the book where they sorry if this is going to get graphic, but we're talking about the Andromeda strain here. But I remember, I don't know, like a doctor or something like cutting open one of the victims' veins and this like powder just coming out basically. And that's what was happening like with the blood. And I think that was one of the like most visceral images I had read up until that point, which it just stuck with me. And I think it's because maybe the connection to Outbreak was so fresh on my mind, and of course that deals a lot with like horrific images of blood too. But man, this book just really got under my skin. And I think the fact too that it was something alien added to it, because not because I necessarily thought back then necessarily thought that aliens were real, but it was one of the first times that I thought, oh, there could be something out there that we've never encountered, which would mean we have zero immunity for and absolutely no preparation like in how to combat it. Which is that's a whole other level of like terrifying too, is an illness that we can't deal with in any sort of way. Like there's no natural immunity, there's no cure or treatment. And even more so than some, I know it sounds a lot like the COVID epidemic, which of course we're going to make those comparisons now, but even more so than that, because at least we knew how vaccines would work against something like that. At least we had some baseline knowledge. But if you're dealing with this extraterrestrial, I mean, how do you really deal with that? So I think it's kind of interesting. I also will say, not to jump there, but I do like how they ended up finding out how to combat this, because that's a whole big part, because they meet these 2 people who are immune. One's a very old man and one's a baby. And I'm pretty sure they keep both of those characters in the adaptation pretty similar. So it's really interesting kind of seeing the scientific stage of that. But yeah, that's my entryway into the Andromeda strain, and one of the things I absolutely love about it.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I found myself while I was rewatching the movie this time, like yelling at people for not wearing proper protection while looking at things that could have been affected by it, or, not taking into consideration how it was mutating, which I think we have like another variant of COVID kind of going around now, this idea of mutation, that's such a problem. So yeah, I feel like in some ways I was really um, paying attention to this based on the background of what had happened just in the last few years. Another thing that I thought was really interesting, and this is in the book and the movie, and that is the idea of it being like a found document situation. So the idea is that it's real. In the book, Crichton has a section at the beginning where it's like, I interviewed these people, or these people were interviewed and these documents were found, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's told very much as if you're looking through kind of documents, in addition to kind of getting an inside view into characters. And the movie does that too. I mean, the beginning of the movie, you're basically seeing all these kind of documents go by, and it says that soon this stuff will be declassified. And the way that the film was handling the story was that you were kind of getting everything that was happening, but then you're also seeing a Senate hearing from afterward going over what was done. And I thought that was an interesting way of doing it. It was also weird watching it after I watched Oppenheimer a few weeks ago, because it's like they were so worried about this atomic bomb that was going to destroy the lab if the contaminant got out. And there was also the Senate hearing about how, well, they shouldn't have spent so much money, and they shouldn't have done this, and they shouldn't have done that. And so that idea of like watching government and science work in tandem and not always work well together was really interesting too, based on what we're experiencing. I wish I could remember my thoughts from the first time I watched this movie many years ago, but I highly doubt that I had was making these sorts of connections. Um, Something else I thought was really interesting about the story is the fact that it's not just it's a truly alien contaminant, and that it's like nothing we could even understand. So they talk about how it lacks all the structures that we would think would mean something's alive, but it obviously is alive. And so I really appreciated Crichton's attempts through actual science to say, like, okay, well, what if there was something that we knew not only came from space and didn't understand if it was sent to us or we brought it back on purpose or by accident or whatever. There's a lot of paranoia in the story too. But what if it doesn't, have amino acids? What if it doesn't have proteins or use them in the same way we do? Like, how do we then deal with a completely new organism? It's not just something that's from space. It's something that doesn't even fully follow the rules that we understand, like you were saying, Lisa. And of course, as a Star Trek fan, once I found out it was crystalline, I just kept thinking of the crystalline entity and how difficult that thing is to deal with. But yeah, I really liked the way it's a purely fictional story, but the tension is heightened by using these kind of found document idea, framing an idea of, okay, well, let's just game out if this was real, what would happen. And I think a lot of science fiction that I read just takes us in kind of in different directions than looking at, okay, well, if we're here on Earth and something comes to us, what does that mean? And those type of stories I think are really entertaining too, and sometimes even more scary, because you know if you're watching a movie or going out into space and like fighting with aliens, that's not necessarily something that may happen in real life, but something coming from space and bothering us with a type of um, makeup or construction that we don't fully understand because it's from somewhere else. I mean, that's verging on weird fiction in a way, something that exists in the universe, but we don't understand it, kind of messing with us.
Yeah. I am thrown by your crystalline entity because I don't know if I know that reference, Mel.
I know you're not a Star Trek person, but I literally yelled that at the screen when I was rewatching the movie. So, and I couldn't get it out of my head. I just couldn't.
um, well, just another little fun fact, since you did bring up Star Trek, that in the 1971 film, Douglas Trumbull did special effects for this movie, which this movie, I think, kind of for film buffs stands out a little bit because they do this kind of split screen effect through a lot of the movie. which is interesting to watch, I think. But I only mentioned that because Trumbull also worked on several other like iconic science fiction films of the time period, including 2001: A Space Odyssey, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Blade Runner, and drumroll, Star Trek, the motion picture. um, so I guess there is that connection, even though I do not know what the crystalline entity is.
You should just look it
Um,
up on Google at some point.
I should. I will do that after this. But yeah, I do. I really like how the science in this is grounded. And I will say, because it made me think of it when you were talking about it, that, and I had forgotten about it and had to look it up. But um, I was trying to remember if the book was written as like a found footage type book, and it is, in that it's supposed to be a report that was like this top secret government report of what happened, and that they were keeping it under wraps. So I guess the idea was that you were reading this like top secret thing, which is the only thing that I kind of find funny about it now, because I have a feeling that if this were to happen, maybe this is how we would know this happened, is because like the government decided to publish its findings in a science fiction book or something like that. I don't know, it just it feels, this is me going into my maybe like alien government conspiracies, which obviously like go back to this book in high school. But I feel like now the way our government is kind of very casually just mentioning non-human entities that have like piloted unidentified flying objects in our, and crashed them apparently in our world. um I do kind of think that sometimes I wonder if they're just trying to prepare us for something worse that actually happened, or where they're like, oh no, first we've got to just like make us cool with the fact that like aliens do exist, and then they're gonna like let something like this out and be like, oh, by the way, this happened. So I don't know, maybe the Andromeda strain is not so far-fetched after all. But um one thing that I did like about this was that, since it is kind of a um like a bacteria or whatever it is that comes from another, I think it is a bacteria that comes from outside of our world, that the idea was is that it's something that is harmless most of the time, but when it came into our atmosphere, it somehow mutated, and this idea that it becomes dangerous then to us, which that becomes a clue in how that they can begin to combat it later, which again I think is very clever the way this book like plays it out. But I think that also adds to, at least for me, the terror of something like this, because when you have like dinosaurs with Jurassic Park, they are behaving as you would expect a dinosaur to behave. I think the terrifying thing is, that you're confronted with the dinosaur, right? But to me, I would be just as terrified if I encountered a bear or if I encountered a lion out in the wild. They're going to do just as much damage to me as a dinosaur, right? And they're acting in a very predictable way. They're acting as predators, or they're protecting their young, or they're protecting their territory. And I'm just like in their way, but they're behaving like a wild animal would. It's scary to watch. It's scary, I'm sure would be scary to experience. But that's where something like this to me is more of a standout and is much more terrifying, is the unpredictable nature of it. The fact that this could be something that was very benign and wouldn't hurt anything, would be very harmless, but just because the pH level changes just a little bit and then suddenly it becomes something that is deadly. Um, that is, I think, what really gets me about something like this too. I also love that part of the reason they solve this is because there's an infant that won't stop crying and it literally doesn't get in enough oxygen to make the bacteria like inhabitable in its body or whatever. So I don't know why I find that very interesting, but that ends up being kind of one of the clues. It's just this kid that won't stop screaming. um I do like that. So yeah.
Yeah, it was a very mundane way to figure out what was going on with this uh, alien life form, basically.
An alien life form that we don't often see in this kind of story, because often it's the aliens have landed, they're intelligent, they're here to, either communicate with us or colonize us or destroy us. This, though, is, at least for me, the way I feel like we will first have, you know, and maybe we already have, but contact with like an alien organism is through something like this. Um, it takes away that, I don't know if intentionality is maybe the word I'm looking for, but yeah, it kind of takes away that, because this is just an organism, and it's just behaving based on its environment, and it just so happens that like our blood is the right pH that makes it kill us.
Yeah, one thing, this is kind of related, but also just something that I noticed while watching the movie was the fact that they kept talking about how the people either dropped dead or I think they actually call it like going crazy or going nuts, which is not type of language I don't think we would use now, but they find someone who, took their own life while this was going on, and a couple other things that they interpret it as the person kind of, I guess, losing their faculties before they died. And I was thinking to myself, I mean, obviously, you have the idea of the oxygen levels in the blood, various other things that could cause such reactions. But also, if I was in this town and something fell from the sky, from space, it looked like a satellite, and when we opened it up, everybody just started literally keeling over, like just falling over dead. I could totally see how some people, maybe not even from what the virus was doing to them, would possibly react in an erratic way before they passed away. Because if you're in a town of like 70 people and you see this happen, that's a pretty traumatic thing to see happen. I would think it would upend your entire worldview. And you're like experiencing the very beginning of what ultimately could be something that sweeps the entire country. Of course, that doesn't happen because it mutates again. But yeah, I was just I felt kind of bad for those people that some of them were being kind of dismissed, because I'm like, that's a part of the story that we don't get to see, is what it would have been like for that small town when this thing falls out of the sky in their town. They open it up, and then this terrible thing starts to happen. Um, I mean, the amount of panic, I think, uh, would, well, since you drop dead so quickly, it wouldn't be allowed to grow that far, I guess. But I think it would be extremely intense. And that's people who are not scientists and are not military and were just like living their lives when this happened in this completely isolated small town in the desert.
Yeah, I think that also plays into some of our fears of government cover up, and like containment is the word that keeps coming to my brain. where if you're on, like you said, if you're in this small town and you're witnessing these things happen, which you're right, it's like people are either dying kind of midday daily activities, or there's all these bizarre deaths by like suicide. And I can't remember now exactly how they explained that, but maybe it was something in the brain that was going on with it. But it would be very terrifying and chaotic to witness it. But then this idea that like on a global level they're trying to contain it and stop, not only contain the like disease or bacteria or whatever contaminant, alien contaminant that is out there, also trying to contain the panic from going elsewhere, and the knowledge of it, which I think is one of the things that some of these different outbreak stories do, which kind of shows the government like shutting down the town or like closing people in or trapping people. There's this idea of kind of like an entrapment happening on a town level, like a small town level, um, which is terrifying in and of itself, I think, um, to watch. Now, the book, tackles it from the scientist's point of view, so that's more of what you're seeing. But um, I think that element is there, and you're right. It's one of the things that I think makes this a standout for me too. And again, I'm only comparing this to Jurassic Park because that was the one we kind of started with this kind of Crichton series. But the Jurassic Park angle of it, you have a couple of things that are major differences, I think, for me. One of them is this idea that they're kind of trapped on an island, so it's like geographically contained. And even though I know like later on some of the Jurassic worlds and stuff, like there's this idea that the dinosaurs are going to go elsewhere, but for the most part, you feel like, okay, as long as I don't go there, I'm not going to encounter any scary velociraptors. But with something like a bacteria, it can, as you pointed out, kind of go to on a global scale very quickly. Like you see how fast it affects this small town. Um, but also there's this idea too of in Jurassic Park that the people did it themselves. Um, like it's the Frankenstein aspect of things, of just because you can do it doesn't mean like should you do it. It's that kind of scientific exploration. Whereas this, I think, is a little bit different. I think this looks a little bit more into what makes us human, because just by the fact that we are human is what puts us at odds with this thing, if that makes sense. In other words, this isn't something we created. This isn't something we like had hubris. The only thing we did was open, like you said, open a satellite that maybe we shouldn't have. Like maybe they should have taken a little bit more care in like looking at this thing. Um, but I don't know, it's a very different thing when you're looking at, okay, this bacteria just ended up in our world and we're completely incompatible with it, versus, we kind of played God and we got a little bit of what we deserved. I think there's a lot less of that here, which makes it really an interesting story.
I agree. I mean, there's kind of a class issue and privilege issue too between the two. I mean, Jurassic Park is created by a a guy who has a lot of disposable income, who just wants to do this to do it, basically. And to go to Jurassic Park, it's not like you or I are going to go to Jurassic Park. I'm pretty sure you're going to have a bit of money to go to the amusement park and enjoy it. And so, the idea of corralling this experience for people who have the means to enjoy it. And like you said, it's not, I mean, unless the dinosaurs continue to procreate and somehow get off the island, it's not affecting people on that grand scale. Whereas, yeah, the Andromeda strain is, every person in this 70-person town died immediately, regardless of any sort of position or anything, except for the old man and the infant, who each for different reasons had the blood makeup that made them able to survive it. Um, and if it spreads out of that town, I think in the movie they kind of talk about like incinerating things to make sure it doesn't spread because it's so dire. If it spreads out of that town, it's not like it's only going to take one part of the population. It's going to take the people who biologically are not, compatible with this crystalline form, and they'll die. So yeah, I think Jurassic Park is much more targeted in who the victims are going to be, whereas the Andromeda strain is on a global and even like galactic scale in a way, because we don't know what the sequel to the Andromeda strain was. It was this an accidental thing? Are the people are there people involved in this in some way that maybe are going to come in the wake of this being unleashed on Earth? We don't know, and so I think those mysteries make it way more terrifying than something like you said is so isolated in something like Jurassic Park.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it is good to point out kind of like the class and privilege issues on both. I think on multiple levels with something like Jurassic Park, because you almost do cheer to see some of the people. I mean, some of the people are truly awful to see them, you know, get what they want. I mean, it is a little bit of Schadenfreude, right? But with something like this, it's we're all we're all equals. We really truly are, and I think they do explore that possibility a lot in the book. Is that maybe this was an intentional like bioweapon that is being used, and they're just kind of waiting for the next attack. So, and that is not just evens the playing field, but I think kind of also unifies everybody in the book in a way that um, we don't quite get in Jurassic Park. Not to say that this is necessarily better or that Jurassic Park is better. They're just very different stories, I think. So it just, well, I mean, really, it just shows, I think, Crichton's mastery that he's able to kind of pull out both of them and that they can be so, so good. Well, I think that is a pretty good place for us to end. We are going to continue talking about Crichton's work, so join us next time, and you can hear us talk about another one of his classic works. I won't tell you which one it is, but I will tell you I think it leans a little bit more on the Jurassic Park side of things than this one did. If you are on social media, please feel free to reach out to us. We would love to hear what you think about our Summer of Crichton. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon, or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.